Yep, sounds good.
Okay, so I'm trying to figure out how to. All right, so I'm going to get started. So good evening. My name is Ed Prindell. I'm the budget manager in the finance department. This is the second year we have done a virtual community budget workshop. Traditionally, we provide 2 in-person workshops in both the western and eastern parts of the city. Due to COVID-19 and closure of our library facilities and social distancing requirements for the council chambers, we are using this platform to do our budget outreach to the community. We would like to thank the City Clerk's Department, Information Technology Department, and City Manager's Office for assisting with this presentation. Several members of the finance team is assisting tonight, including the Finance Director, David Bilby, and several of our analysts, Nicole Remiker, Sandy Delap, and Maritza Vargas. We have Bob Beeman from the Engineering Department and Carrie Bigelow from the City Clerk's Office. This presentation will be recorded and made available to the public. The agenda for this evening is a presentation on the fiscal year 2022 proposed budget. We will go over the all funds fund summary, general fund summary, Measure A sales tax fund summary, and Measure P sales tax fund summary. We will then go over the fiscal year 2022 capital improvements program, and then finally the next steps of the budget process. We ask that all questions be added to the end of the presentation. Questions will have to be provided using the Q&A sidebar in the WebEx application. At this point, I will start our presentation. Thank you. I will share some budgetary notes for the fiscal year 2022. We continue to see the impacts of COVID-19 on city and especially general fund revenues, which we will discuss further in future slides. What is not included in the fiscal year 2022 proposed budget presented tonight is the anticipated funding that will be received from the recent passage of the Federal American Rescue Plan for responding to COVID-19 and its economic impacts. On the next slide, I'll provide a little more information on the American Rescue Plan. We will also discuss the recent issuance of pension obligation bonds to address retirement obligations, which will provide the city significant cost savings in future years. The city of Chula Vista is expecting to receive approximately $61 million allocation of federal relief funds from the American Rescue Plan Act, or ARP. Funds will be required to be spent by December 31st, 2024. Please note that ARP is not included in the fiscal year 2022 budget and will be appropriated at a later date when funds and funding guidelines are received from the U.S. Department of Treasury. Some of the ARP eligible expenses include responding to COVID-19 and its negative economic impacts, including aid to households, small businesses, and affected industries, premium pay for eligible essential workers, investments in water, sewer, or broadband infrastructure. Next steps will include departmental input and community outreach, survey and data gathering, creation of a spending plan for council consideration, and then staff will bring forward a separate action to appropriate the funding once those funds have been received, along with how those funds will be utilized based on the rules provided by the U.S. Department of Treasury. In February 2011, the city issued $350 million in pension obligation bonds, or POBs, to manage retirement costs at a 2.5.4% interest rate for a 24-year term. A pension obligation bond is a taxable bond issued to investors, with proceeds utilized to refinance part of the city's pension liabilities, known as the unfunded accrued liability, or UAL. The UAL is a shortfall between what the city has in assets and what it will need in assets to fully pay out the benefits that it has promised to retirees under CalPERS, who administers the city's pension plan. CalPERS charges the city a 7% interest rate on the city's pension UAL and enforces a mandatory repayment schedule. Issuance of the POBs provided the city several benefits, including number one, generating cash flow savings to historically low interest rates relative to the CalPERS discount rate assumption. Number two, creating a repayment shape for the city's pension liabilities that increases more gradually than currently mandated by CalPERS. Number 3, enhancing budget predictability and long-term fiscal sustainability by creating a smoother repayment schedule at a lower level. Number 4, leveraging the projected savings to adequately fund various reserves. And number 5, setting aside a portion of the future savings into a new Section 115 trust fund to mitigate future pension and other post-employment benefit cost increases and potentially pay off or redeem the POBs prior to maturity. The budgetary impact of the POBs in the fiscal year 22 budget includes elimination of the UAL obligation, reducing personnel expenses, establishing pension obligation bonds debt service repayment schedules, resulting in an increased expenditure in the transfer out and other expense categories, and establishing a new 115 trust fund and contributing to the trust to address future pension liabilities. Further information will be available in the proposed budget document, and information on the pension obligation bonds can also be found on the city's website. The chart here shows the restructuring strategy from 2022 to 2045, with the green line representing the new debt repayment for the POBs, and the blue bars representing the prior repayment schedule of the UAL with CalPERS for illustrative purposes. The fiscal year 22 proposed budget projections and assumptions were prepared prior to the receipt of the city's allocation from the American Rescue Plan Act. Updated projections and recommended changes to the budget likely will be brought back for council consideration in early fiscal year 2022, if not sooner. The all funds summary section for revenues and expenditures currently shows that the city has over 150 different funds that make up the City of Chula Vista's all funds budget. This presentation will concentrate primarily on the general fund, which is used to pay for the day-to-day operations of the city, including police, fire, parks, and recreation, library, and other related departments. This slide represents all budgeted funds. The fiscal year 2021 adopted budget revenues exceed expenditures, resulting in a budgeted surplus of $1.8 million. The fiscal year 22 proposed budget expenses exceed revenues by a total of $10.1 million, which is a planned use of available fund balance for fiscal year 2022, which is an overall change of $11.9 million when compared to the fiscal year 2021 adopted budget. The fiscal year 2022 proposed budget includes the following budgetary highlights. The first full year of funding for the new medical transport services program operated by the fire department. Various capital projects, including funding the reconstruction of the Loma Verde Recreation Center, repairs of various city facilities and park improvements, repair and maintenance to sidewalks, corrugated metal pipe rehabilitation, and citywide communication improvements, increased tree trimming improvements, increased library funding for books, and funding for maintenance costs of 2 new parks are just a few of the highlights that are included within the budget. The all funds revenues for the fiscal year 22 proposed budget increased by $57.2 million compared to the fiscal year 21 adopted budget. And I will go over the changes between the fiscal year 22 proposed and fiscal year 21 adopted budget amounts. Some of the numbers are inflated due to the fact that the funds received in one fund and transferred to another fund is double counted on this slide. For example, Measure A and Measure P sales taxes are both collected in the general fund and then transferred to their own respective funds. Both the revenues received by the general fund and the revenues received by both the Measure A and Measure P funds are counted in this schedule, thus inflating the actual numbers. We will focus on the significant revenue changes, starting with the property taxes category that increased by $3.1 million, which is $1.9 million for property taxes and another $1.2 million for motor vehicle license fee revenues tied to assessed valuations of properties within the city. The next significant change is a $9.2 million increase of other local taxes, which accounts primarily for the following revenues. $3 million increase for both Measure A sales tax and $3 million increase for Measure P sales tax. $2.6 million increase of the standard Bradley Burns sales tax, and $1.8 million increase of the cannabis excise tax. Other agency revenues decreased by $3.9 million. This reflects a $1.9 million decrease in contributions from other agencies in the Advanced Life Support Fund due to the elimination of the AMR contract, and $1.9 million reduction in grant funds from other agencies. Charges for services increased by $15.8 million. The significant driver of the $13.8 million for the new Transport Enterprise Fund and $3 million for the Sewer Service Revenue Fund. Lastly, transfers from other funds increased by $32.1 million, primarily for the following: $16.3 million for the Pension Obligation Bonds Debt Service Fund, $8.3 million for the Section 115 Trust Fund contribution related to future retirement costs, $2.8 million transferred to the Measure A Sales Tax Fund, and $2.8 million transferred to the Measure P Sales Tax Fund. This slide represents all funds expenses by budget category. Personnel services increased by $10.8 million when comparing the fiscal year 21 adopted budget to the fiscal year 22 proposed budget. The contributor is the addition of new positions added as part of the mid-year addition, including the positions related to the Transport Enterprise Fund and Measure A Fund. The salary savings target decreased by $1.4 million. Retirement benefits decreased by $23.2 million, which is primarily tied to the elimination of the unfunded actuarial liability, or UAL, that was discussed previously, due to the issuance of the pension obligation bonds. This result is an increase of pension bond debt service and contributions to the Section 115 trust mentioned previously also. Health insurance costs increased by $2.5 million for a total personnel decrease of $8.5 million for all funds personnel expenses. Supplies and services increase of $2.3 million is primarily due to establishing a $2.1 million supplies and services budget for the transport program and approximately $1 million increase in overall insurance cost increases. Other expenses increased by $16 million, mostly for debt service payments for the new pension obligation bonds, capital decrease of $1.7 million that is tied to reductions in the Measure P Fund and federal grant fund capital expenses in fiscal year 22 compared to 21. CIP project expenditures increased by $27.3 million, with the primary drivers in the Measure P Fund for $23.8 million and transportation grant gas tax for $1 million, the sewer DIP fund at $1.4 million. Overall, the all funds expenses increased by $69 million. We have taken the 150 funds and grouped them into categories shown on this slide for illustrative purposes. This slide represents all funds budgeted revenues by fund type. The general fund makes up the largest fund making up 47% of all revenues budgeted, followed by the sewer fund at 9%, and then debt funds at 6%, followed by Measure A and Measure P sales tax funds at 5% each. This slide represents all funds budgeted expenses by fund type, which the general fund is the largest fund making up 46% of all expenses, followed by the sewer fund at 9%, Measure P sales tax fund at 9%, and both enterprise and debt funds at 6% each. So overall, staffing levels in the fiscal year 22 proposed budget increased by 24.5 FTEs compared to the fiscal year 21 adopted budget. Just for clarification, FTE stands for full-time equivalent positions. In other words, we went from 1,161.75 positions to 1,186.25 positions. The general fund change is an increase of 3.5 FTEs for a total of 850.25 positions in fiscal year 2022. The non-general fund changes is a net increase of 21 FTEs for a total of 336 positions in fiscal year 2022. And we will go over the position changes over the next few slides. In fiscal year 21, mid-year changes resulted in a net change of 17 positions in the Measure A Sales Tax Fund. The result was a net of 13 positions in the police department and 4 positions in the fire department that was consistent with the Measure A spending plan as shown on this slide. The following position changes as part of the development of the fiscal year 2022 proposed budget that resulted in 7.5 overall positions. The general fund changes include a net addition of 3.5 positions. That includes the following changes. The administration department addition of 1 special projects manager and reduction of 1 executive secretary and reduction of 1 senior graphic designer, resulting in a net decrease of 1 position. The city clerk department has an addition of 1 fiscal office specialist. The economic development department transfer of 1 environmental services manager from the general fund to the environmental services fund, resulting in a decrease of 1 position. The finance department addition of 1 revenue manager and 1 senior management analyst, resulting in 2 positions. The fire department transfer from the ALS fund of 1 EMS inventory specialist. The human resources department addition of 0.5 fiscal office specialist positions. The information technology services department addition of 1 senior network engineer. The library department reduction of 1 cultural arts program manager position. And then parks and recreation department addition of 1 senior parks ranger position. All of the changes resulted in a net increase to the general fund of 3.5 positions. The Measure A fund is adding 3 positions to the police department consistent with the public safety and tenant safety plan that includes the addition of 2 police agents and 1 police sergeant. The federal grants fund is reducing 1 senior financial analyst in the federal grants fund. The environmental services fund has a transfer of 1 environmental services manager from the general fund. The fleet management fund is adding 1 equipment mechanic and 1 senior management analyst, resulting in 2 positions. And for implementation of the fire department's new transport program, all but 1 position is being transferred from the Advanced Life Support Fund to the Transportation Fund. 1 position, the EMS inventory specialist, is transferred to the general fund as previously mentioned, and this is being done due to the creation of a new transport fund. So this is a budgetary correction to the fiscal year 21 adopted budget. So moving on to the general fund. The fiscal year 22 general fund revenue and expenses are projected to increase by $11.4 million over the fiscal year 21 adopted budget for a total of $218.1 million. The general fund budget is balanced for fiscal year 2022. General fund revenues are projected to increase by $11.4 million or 5.5%. We will discuss the remaining revenue assumptions on the following slides. The revenue categories that have most sensitivity to the current economic environment are sales-related taxes, transit occupancy taxes, and charges for services that are within the other general fund revenue category. Staff will continue to monitor revenues in light of the current uncertainty of the current economic conditions. The fiscal year 22 major general fund revenues are projected to increase by $10.9 million or 6.8% over the fiscal year 21 adopted budget. The primary drivers include Measure A and Measure P are each projected to increase by approximately $3 million over the fiscal year 21 adopted budget for a total of $6 million increase based on data from our sales tax consultant received in January. Sales tax revenues are projected to increase by $2.8 million over the fiscal year 21 adopted budget. Property tax and motor vehicle license fees revenues are projected to increase by $2.9 million. As we have seen over the last several years, utility user taxes have been trending downwards, and the fiscal year 22 budget shows a $1.4 million decrease. Staff utilized conservative growth rate assumptions for the other major revenues categories besides sales tax that range from 0.5% to 3% annualized growth. The other revenues category increased by $0.5 million compared to the fiscal year 21 adopted budget. This includes $1.3 million increase in other local taxes, including a $0.5 million decrease in business license tax due to continued COVID-19 restrictions and impacts, as well as a $1.8 million increase in cannabis excise taxes with anticipation of additional legal cannabis-based businesses opening in fiscal year 2022. $1.2 million increase to transfers and reimbursements from other funds for allocated overhead expenses to the general fund. $0.9 million decrease to other revenues decreases for interfund reimbursements. $0.8 million decrease to charges for services with anticipated gradual reopening of city facilities during fiscal year 22. And then $0.2 million decrease in fines and penalties due to less than anticipated activity anticipated in fiscal year 2022. General fund expenditures increased by $11.4 million or 5.2%. We will discuss the significant expenditure assumptions on the following slides. Personnel-related activities decreased overall by $13.2 million. Personnel service expenses increased by approximately $3.1 million for a total of $97 million. Decrease of the salary savings target of $1.8 million compared to the fiscal year 21 adopted budget for a total of $1.6 million. With the issuance of the pension obligation bonds, the unfunded actuarial liabilities was paid off. This has decreased pension costs by $19.3 million in fiscal year 22. As a result, there is a significant increased cost for POB debt service and contributions to a Section 115 trust from cost savings in the transfer out expense category. Normal costs for PERS increased by $0.7 million in fiscal year 22. Flex insurance costs increased by approximately $1.1 million due to an increase in this year's insurance premiums for a total of $13.3 million. Supplies and services increased overall by $0.6 million, which includes the city's liability and related insurance costs increased this year by approximately $1 million. Landscape and program supplies increased by approximately $0.3 million. Books and periodicals increased by $0.1 million, and then contract services decreased by $0.9 million. Other expense assumptions increased by $0.8 million for expenses paid to the California Department of Tax and Fee Administration for the collection and administration and distribution of our sales tax Measure A and Measure P sales tax revenues. Transfer outs increased by $23.1 million, which includes an increased transfer out of $2.8 million for the Measure A and Measure P sales tax revenues collected in the general fund and transferred to their respective funds for a total of $5.6 million. The general fund portion of the pension obligation bond debt service obligation is $11.7 million that is being transferred out into a separate debt service fund. As well, lastly, the Section 115 trust fund contribution is $5.9 million that will be transferred into its own fund. Moving on to the Measure A revenue and expenditures analysis, this is a comparative analysis between the fiscal year 21 adopted budget and the fiscal year 22 proposed budget for revenues and expenditures for the Measure A fund. Measure A funds are used to fund public safety staffing in both the police and fire departments. The Measure A Public Safety Expenditure Plan was recently approved by the Measure A Citizens Oversight Committee. Measure A total expenses increased by $3.3 million and revenues increased by approximately $3 million. The largest expense increase is for transfer out of $1.8 million due to new expenses for the pension obligation bond debt service and Section 115 trust contributions. This slide represents a comparative analysis between fiscal year 21 adopted budget and the fiscal year 22 proposed budget for revenues and expenditures for the Measure P fund. The Measure P fund is used for the replacement and repair of capital assets to address the city's deferred maintenance needs. The Measure P spending plan was recently approved by the Measure P Citizens Oversight Committee. This includes a total expense of $23.4 million and a total revenue increase of $2.8 million. Available fund balance will be used to cover expenses for fiscal year 2022. The largest expense increase is for CIP expenses with a total budget of $23.4 million increase. And this includes $15 million for the Loma Verde Recreation Center, $4.4 million for other public infrastructure, including storm drains, sidewalks, and tree removal, $2.5 million for park facilities, and $1.8 million for other facility repairs. At this point, this concludes my presentation. I will hand it over to Mr. Bob Beeman to go over the city's fiscal year 22 capital improvement program budget.
Thank you, Ed. I'm going to give a quick overview of the CIP program, which is proposed at $49.2 million. This slide shows a breakdown of funding by asset management system. As indicated, over 42% has been programmed for buildings, and the railway system represents the next highest at nearly 34%. Next slide. This slide provides a breakdown by funding source. As indicated, most of the CIP program is funded by Measure P at over 55%, and Transnet and Gas Tech combined makes up about 30%. On average, that number would normally be over 50%. Next slide. Some of the major highlights for next fiscal year includes $10.5 million has been programmed to complete pavement rehab projects on major and local streets to extend street life. The city will also be completing drainage and sewer projects at over $4 million each. There's funding of over $2.8 billion programmed to complete repairs for parks, courts, and sports fields. Next slide. There's also over $20 million programmed for building projects, including $15.1 million to reconstruct the Loma Verde Recreation Center. This project is a great example of how Measure P has positively impacted the CIP program by being able to design and reconstruct a facility that is nearly 50 years old and is highly used by the community. There's also Measure P funding associated with completing repairs at other public buildings, such as the fire stations, the police facility, and the libraries. Also, after the Boys and Girls Club has been renovated, the Community Services Department will be taking over operations of that facility. Next slide. Over the past year, the city administered 3 pavement projects that treated 157 roadway segments, which amounted to over 22 miles of roadways reconditioned. The total cost of these projects was $20 million, and approximately $15 million was funded by Measure P to rehab residential streets. Next slide. The city received a Smart Growth Incentive Program grant of $2.5 million to complete the third and final phase of the 3rd Avenue Streetscape project. This project was completed in January of this year. Next slide. Construction of Fire Station 5 began in March of last year and was completed in March of this year. Next slide. And the construction of Fire Station 9 began in April of last year and was completed this month. The total cost for both fire stations was $20 million and was funded by Measure P. Next slide. The city is also overseeing an emergency repair of a sinkhole on Energy Way, which involved tunneling under the street to repair a 66-inch diameter pipe. This project should be completed next month. And you can see the photos of that work. Next slide. This slide shows a snapshot of the CIP program over the last 10 years. The top line shows the overall CIP. As you can see, there was a spike in funding in fiscal year 18 and another spike proposed for next fiscal year due to the increase in Measure P funding, which will allow the city to complete additional improvements associated with buildings, drainage, parks, and so on. That completes the CIP presentation, so I turn it back over to finance.
Ed, this is Carrie. If you're speaking, we can't hear you. Your microphone is muted.
Okay, sorry, I couldn't figure out how to unmute. I apologize. So the next steps in the budget development process are reflected on this slide. As part of the budget development process, staff will continue to make revisions to the budget numbers. Staff is working to assemble the city manager's proposed fiscal year 22 budget document. It will be presenting the budget to the city council on May 11th. The city council hearing and adoption of the budget is scheduled for May 25th. At this point, this concludes our presentation of the fiscal year 22 proposed budget. Staff is available to answer your questions. Thank you. Are there any questions?
We don't have any questions at this time. Anyone who's attending, we are accepting questions under the Q&A box, which you should see on your screen. So please go ahead and submit any questions that you have there, and we will answer those for you. We still don't have any questions, although I will put in the chat for everyone the direct link to submit any e-comments. So if you'd like to submit any e-comments on the budget presentation that you heard today, you're welcome to do that as well. So if you check your chat, you'll see the link to submit e-comments.
And then also the presentation will be available, and they could also submit comments on our website for any updates, and the budget will be posted next week. So the actual budget document will be available for members of the public to review. And then on top of that, on May 11th, the city council will hear the budget, and there'll be another opportunity for the public to chime in with any comments or recommendations or thoughts pertaining to the fiscal year 22 proposed budget.
Thank you, Ed. We do have one question. The question is, with all the repairs around town, could we add something about subcontractor transparency?
I think that's more of a question for engineering. David, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think Bill or Bob could speak to that question.
Yeah, I would just mention all of our contracts are publicly bid, and I believe the contractors do work with various subs. So I don't know if we have a list available where you could put your name on it, but we do advertise all of our jobs, and all contractors are free to bid on them.
Thank you. There's a follow-up comment if it adds any clarity to the question. The follow-up comment says it seems like there are way too many projects with a lack of oversight.
Yeah, I would need specific examples. What do you mean without the lack of oversight? You mean that we are using, and in some cases we are using consultants, but we do have we also have staff that are inspecting the projects as well. So, I would need specific example of what you're referring to.
Bob, if it's okay with you, I'll respond to this individual with your email address, and he can follow up with you with direct questions.
Oh, perfect. Thank you.
Are there any other questions, Carrie?
No, there are no other questions at this time.
Do you want to give her a few more minutes or?
I think you may want to do that in case there are any last minute questions, if you want to give another 2 or 3 minutes.
Okay.
Ed, we have no other questions at this time.
Okay. Well, at this point, that concludes our budget workshop. And thank you for participating. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact the finance department through the website. And we look forward to hearing from the members of the public. And thank you for participating. So thank you. Have a good night.